It's great to be here. Thank you for the introduction. And I want to first just congratulate all the faculty and staff and volunteers and students who put this on. It's a great opportunity to connect people that have been in this field for a while with people from the community and students. I really appreciate it and being invited to be here and to play this role. And in fact, a couple of years ago, on a more personal note, I began to realize that in the next phase of my life, I wanted to have more contact with students and in a university setting. And so I realized that University of Maryland was the one and only college or university that was biking distance from my home in Hyattsville. So I had no idea what to expect, but I started to ask around, and what I found was that the diversity and the sophistication of things in terms of social enterprise and social entrepreneurship was striking, but so was the welcoming nature of the people that were involved in it and how they opened up to me and invited me to participate in different ways. Bob Grimm, Sarah Harold, Christine Beckman, and many others. And so I'm just really very pleased to be here. And there are many speakers, including myself. I'll be here for the whole day that can interact with you if you want to talk about these issues further. But if you want to know what it is, someone you might not know that's here, that knows what it is to put together a major social enterprise and a sustainable one, I want to introduce my former colleague and friend, Sabrina Qureshi, who put together the world's largest reserve corps of volunteers, 20,000 plus, focused on poverty, who contribute $7 million of in-kind services per year, and is due to break even this year and to make a profit next year in making those connections. So Sabrina, would you just stand up? People know who you are, and so glad you're here. What I'm going to cover in the next few minutes, I hope to leave enough time for questions at the end, is basically I'm going to talk about how I got into this line of work. And then one kind of series of related things I did at Grameen Foundation, and then I'm just going to share a couple of reflections of what I learned in the process. So let me take you back to the mid-'80s at Cornell. There were students, as I'm sure there are on this campus, who were protesting against some of the intolerable things in the world at the time, apartheid, the wars going on in Central America. And this somehow got me thinking about, if there are these terrible things going on, there must also be some good things going on, some solutions to these problems. So I became obsessed with the issue of poverty and who was actually making progress on the issue of poverty. And I became obsessed like only an undergraduate who's fueled by pizza and beer, mainly, can be. I'm sure none of you subsist on food that's not good for you and beer, but in the 80s, that's how we did it. And so then I heard about, and I wanted to, what was something that was positive, that was sustainable, that was business-like? And I kept having people point me in the direction of the Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh. There was no internet, there was no Google to search what he was doing. There were a few crusty papers in the library that I was able to find. But what I was able to learn was that here was a man who invented a banking system to turn destitute women and let them get in touch with their inner entrepreneurial capacity and work their way out of poverty. Now, there were others, great organizations like Action and Opportunity International that were doing this, but I was particularly attracted to something that emanated out of a third world country and someone from that country who developed this alternative banking system. So a mentor of mine, and later to become a very close friend, suggested that I not just be fascinated, but I write Muhammad Yunus a letter. And I said, what the hell am I going to write him? He said, well, write him that you want to join forces with him to defeat world poverty. This is a guy who always thought kind of big. So I said, really? So I wrote him that letter. And I got so kind of worked up about it, it became so grandiose. I joked that this is almost true, that I wrote him and proposed the Yunus Counts plan for the eradication of world poverty, and would he join my team and have me, come out there for a few years to start. I wrote him that letter. I still walk by the mailbox in Washington, D.C. that I put that in April of 1987. Put it in, and I waited. Again, the instant gratification of email responses in minutes and hours was not yet the culture. And I waited. And he wrote me back. I still have that letter today. And in a way that was both very flattering and welcoming and also a bit wary, he invited me to come to Bangladesh, and he said, you might try to pick up the language before you come. I'd never done anything really good in languages before, but I was so honored, and I threw myself into learning Bengali, which I was later able to learn pretty well. And I got a Fulbright fellowship, which eased the process of going there after I'm always been a huge advocate of the Fulbright program. It could be a way for some of you to go into whatever your career is, including social enterprise. And then I spent 6 years living in Bangladesh, 6 of the first 9 years out of college. It was incredible. I shared the life and the diseases and the food and the rhythms of the rural poor of Bangladesh. I've had malaria, I've had typhoid, I've had dysentery. If you're doing a blood drive, you don't want me. They'll turn me away. I've been there. I wrote a book that was mentioned in the introduction, Small Loans, Big Dreams, that allowed me to go deeply into the lives of about 7 or 8 women in rural Bangladesh who'd been touched by Grameen. Some of them achieved big progress, some small progress. They opened up to me, and I began to get, and after being there for 6 years, I began to go back to my original vision of what I would do with Muhammad Yunus, which was open up an international program and an international agenda for Grameen, of what Grameen could do outside of Bangladesh. So the time came when we were talking about starting what became Grameen Foundation, and he said, well, I'll give you a little money to start with, and as you just heard, he gave me $6,000 US. Having spent most of my adult life in Bangladesh up to that point, I thought that was a lot of money to start an organization with. It wasn't. But it was enough. By the way, if anyone ever comes to any of you and asks you to start an organization with $6,000, please come and talk to me first before you agree to do it. But I was ready, because what I'd seen in Bangladesh and what I'd seen in other countries is at its core, and this is another one of my mentors, Susan Davis, who worked for the Ford Foundation in Bangladesh then, and she said, you know, we always talk about what's the poor lack, and they lack money, they may lack formal education, but the truth of the matter is that if you live in a country like Bangladesh where there are not enough jobs and there's no social safety net, you have a very stark life choice. You work for yourself or you starve. And if those are the choices, you find whatever entrepreneurial ability you have. It may be a lot more than you ever realized, it may be a little, and you work it and you learn from your mistakes, because whether you put food on the table for your children that night depends on it. And so the idea behind Grameen was to put a little capital behind that entrepreneurial spirit. Most of the world's poor are already entrepreneurs, are already running tiny businesses. And then I went to the Philippines. Professor Yunus started to send me out a little bit, do some prospecting, and I met a tiny storekeeper in Manila. And I asked him where he got the money for his little store. You could more or less fit all of his merchandise into this podium, and he'd sell it on the streets of Manila. And I said, where do you get the capital to buy your merchandise? And he says, I get it from a 5.6. I said, what's a 5.6? He said, everyone knows what a 5.6 is. I said, I'm not from around here. He says, it's the guy you go to in the market where you borrow 5 pesos in the morning and you pay back 6 pesos in the evening, or 500 and 600. And I said, this is how the world's poor finance their businesses, paying 20% interest per day. I said, there's a business opportunity here. There's a disruptive opportunity for doing a sustainable social business to create massive impact. And so that's what I came back to the US to start in 1997. And so I thought that the big area for us to work in would be Latin America. I was trying to teach myself Spanish. And then, as often happens in a startup environment, you got dealt a different set of cards than you thought. I had 3 leaders who were applying Grameen principles in India come to me in the beginning of 2000, and they said, we've got a head of steam. We're reaching 46,000 women across India, the 3 of our organizations together, and we've got a plan that if someone were to give us $1 million up front, we could attract $7 million more from local sources, mainly borrowing from commercial banks. in India, and we want you to give us that $1 million by the end of the year. Now, Grameen Foundation's annual budget at that point was not $1 million. And they wanted $1 million for just one program in India. But I was up for the adventure. I loved their daring and how confident they were. And so I looked through my business cards, and it turned out that one of the business cards on my desk was a guy by the name of Stephen Rockefeller Jr. And I said, I sure hope he's one of those Rockefellers. And he was. And he had just turned 40. I was just over 30. And he was ready to do something philanthropic, and not just because he had the name and some of the family money to give away. And so we went out and we raised $1 million in 3 weeks in June of 2000. More than I'd ever done before. And I can still, the pitch I gave so many times with increasing confidence, I can still give it today. You woke me up in the middle of the night, I could still give it. And then we sent the $1 million there, and those organizations, they want to grow from 46,000 to 164,000 clients in 30 months, and they did it 6 months early. And that became a signature success for them and for us, and helped us grow into the organization we became. Now, I thought raising $1 million was now pretty easy, but we'd gone to all of Steve's contacts. The economy started tanking in the latter half of 2000, so I did two things. I said, well, I'll just raise another $1 million anytime I want. And I sent 2 volunteers who later became board members to India to say where we would spend the next $1 million. So now I was realizing that the economy in the tank, we needed to develop some new contacts. So the 2 guys who I wished at that moment I never sent to India called me on the day after Easter 2001 and said, Alex, we've had a great insight about India and how to finance the growth of microfinance there. He said, the money's all here. And I said, Jim, that's good, because it's not here. And what he found is that especially at that time, the banks were under a lot of regulatory pressure to put their excess funds, their excess liquidity, into things that were doing social good. It was kind of the Community Reinvestment Act here, but on a bigger scale. So what we ended up doing that second year is we only raised $260,000 compared to $1 million the previous year. But a young Bangladeshi woman working with Jim and another guy who contacts in India, they figured out a way for us to put that money as a guarantee or a deposit, $260,000, so that the banks would lend 10 times that amount to the organizations we were working with in India, 10-to-1 leverage. So we had a fundraising shortfall, actually brought more money than it had the previous year. And that became a theme of ours for the rest of, even today, Grameen Foundation, of how do you tap into local resources. There's a lot of human resources, financial resources, reputational resources that exist within these countries. The question is, how do you come in and activate them? How do you take dead capital on the sidelines, and put it to work for poverty alleviation? We had a major program that I won't go into around micro savings, where the Gates Foundation helped us work with 3 organizations, a different 3, to bring in 1 million savers, which helps them build assets, but also that savings can be then relent to people who have entrepreneurial ideas in India, Philippines, and Ethiopia. And then this whole thing that began with these 3 leaders coming up to me, we started an investment bank, a boutique investment bank called Grameen Capital India in India, that is still around to this day. It took 4 years to get launched and get all the signatures and everything. This is an organization that we raised $400,000 for, got 2 Indian banks to put in another $600,000, $1 million of capital. And this organization with $1 million of seed capital has brought $180 million of debt and equity to social enterprises throughout India, and in several years has made a profit doing so. Again, the guy, Jim Greenberg, who called me with that news, is the chairman of the board, and he's just turning that over to an Indian lawyer this year. And then the last part of this, loan guarantees, that was the insight of that fundraising shortfall. We created a global loan guarantee facility called the Growth Guarantees, where we took $31 million of assets of our board members mainly, and we used that as a pool to provide partial guarantees so banks throughout developing world, I think 15 different countries, would loan to social enterprises and microfinance institutions, and if the loan went bad, we would be partially responsible through our $31 million fund. Well, that facility ended up guaranteeing $230 million of loans, and the total default over the 10-year life of it was $140,000. So you can do the math, but it's a tiny default rate. And so that was all, a lot of it originated in India, which is where we didn't expect to be working mainly. And it was about activating local sources of capital to scale social enterprise. And it won't be surprising to you that just announced about 2 weeks ago was after having retired as the CEO of Grameen Foundation, I was appointed the CEO of the American India Foundation, which is a leading organization to channel both the Indian diaspora and other people who love India to accelerate poverty alleviation there. And so I'm thrilled about that. So what did I learn in this journey? Let me tick off a couple of them. And I got the wider journey, but also just the part of that I told you. The first thing I learned when I kind of thought about this is, you have an idea, go for it, right? There's so many people that question themselves, that allow people to poke holes in their ideas, and there's a role for that. But in fact, one of my mentors and teachers, a guy by the name of Dave Ellis, who wrote what I think is still now the top-selling college textbook in America, he had a 3-point version of just do it or go for it. He said, the trick, one of the keys to life is figuring out what you want, getting proud of it, and then asking for it. So let's just deconstruct that for a second, because it's been very, very influential in my life. A lot of people, whatever it's about their career, their family, or about the change they want to make in the world, they don't spend nearly enough time thinking deeply about what they want. They may be thinking about what other people think they should want, but just getting into what's the problem I want to solve and how do I want to solve it that'll be really enjoyable and stimulating for me. And then of course, number 3, once you've sorted that out, then you just need to start asking people to help you. But the middle one is what took a while for me to appreciate. Get proud of it. See, because I think a lot of people, especially people with fears about fundraising and more generally asking people to help them, is they kind of don't get to that point where they're just so comfortable with their desire and in fact, just want people to join in because they're going to have as much fun in joining them as they're going to have in being part of that. And I can't tell you how many times young people or people at mid-career transition points have asked me for some help, but they've done it in a kind of a half-hearted, apologetic way. They hadn't taken that time to just get so excited and proud of what they wanted that their attitude was, this is going to work, Alex. If you want to be part of my team and have some of the fun, you can do it, but I'm going to find a team because this is an awesome thing. So that became, and Steve Rockefeller really helped me in that first fundraising campaign. Can get clear, I wanted to help these Indian leaders quadruple their outreach, and it was just the most amazing, fun thing, and I was just offering people if they wanted to put some money on the table and share in the success they could, and if they didn't, we would find other people. So that's one, I think, kind of core lesson. Second one is, I don't know, somehow particularly in the not-for-profit space, the term opportunism got a little bit of a bad connotation around it, right? Somehow, and I don't find people in business feeling this way, but people saying, you want to set a plan and stick to it, and don't get tempted to go off in a different direction to follow some random opportunity. Well, there are so many ways to affect social change, and sometimes your assumptions about your original plan and path are so wrong, like our assumption that our biggest impact we would have is in Latin America, that if you're not open to opportunities and seizing them and running with them, and then, as I did with this in India, leading to creating a boutique investment bank, creating a global loan guarantee facility, if you just kind of stick with a plan that you developed under what are probably somewhat faulty assumptions, you're going to miss some huge chances to have impact. So let opportunities lead you as much as your plan and your assumptions. Third, maybe the most important one is find mentors. Find people. Once you are starting to get clear about the change you want to make in the world, find elder statesmen and elder stateswomen who you admire and ask them to help you, ask them to advise you, ask them to help mold you. I have never, ever, ever had someone I asked to mentor me say no. Now, there are many informal mentors, but I'm talking about, would you actually meet with me on a monthly, quarterly, weekly basis to help share in whatever I'm grappling with? I've never. In fact, one little story, John C. Whitehead, who was the chairman of Goldman Sachs, was the number 2 at the State Department in Reagan's second term, and was asked in the aftermath of 9/11 to oversee the work of rebuilding Lower Manhattan. I asked him to mentor me in his late 70s. He agreed immediately. Over the course of the last 15 years of his life, he would always return my calls within 2 days. One time I was talking to him and they said, his secretary came and said, Mr. Whitehead, everyone called him Mr. Whitehead, by the way. Mr. Whitehead, Governor Pataki is on the line. This is when the kind of heyday of rebuilding. And he said, I'll call him back. I'm in with Alex, right? This is something that was must have been, in some level, so nurturing to him to help shape an up-and-coming leader. It was more important to them than talking to the governor of New York about rebuilding Lower Manhattan, at least in that moment. I'll be thinking about that as long as I'm alive. So find people. You'll be shocked by how excited they'll be to play that mentorship role. I want to talk for a second about loyalty. You know, as you go into your careers, whether it's in social enterprise or some other career, you'll probably have people advising you, probably some of these mentors, who will say to you, you're working somewhere, but you're not getting promoted fast enough, or you need to fill out something more on your resume, so just jump around and and there's some wisdom in that. But I'll tell you, some of the people I've valued most in my career that I've also tried to give the most back to are the people that were working with me, whether I was in a board role or a CEO role, who everyone knew that they were there long past the point where they were not optimizing their learning or their resume building or their income, but they felt that my organization or that I had given them a chance, and they were going to play this one out. They were going to stick with me and stick with that organization or with the CEO if I was in a board role. And so kind of checking whether going into that careerism mode where you're trying to build your resume, are you actually short-circuiting some long-term relationships that people can see that you're there for a bigger cause and a bigger mission than resume building. And also being loyal to the people who help get you there. I've told that story about getting the 10-to-1 leverage, and I always try to discipline myself to mention Sharmi Saban, the Bangladeshi American woman who thought up that idea, which was such a breakthrough for us. Sharing the credit, I guess you could say. And then the last thing that I maybe mention before we open up to questions, I think I've left enough time for them, is, and this is an insight I've only had in the last few years, is once you get into a position where you develop some mastery over your profession, or at least a reputation for mastery, there's a real risk that you become kind of intellectually complacent. And so one of the things I did about 9 years ago is, in a very random, fun thing, is I became involved with a bunch of musicians who were from down south, mainly North Carolina and Tennessee, Nashville. And I basically became a kind of an amateur volunteer and not particularly good band promoter and music promoter as a hobby. And I'm still not that good, but I'm a little better than I used to be. But one of the things that I discovered is that putting myself in a role like I was in Bangladesh on my Fulbright, where I was a sponge for absorbing something new, a language, a culture, an approach to addressing poverty, is that beginner's mind is a learner's mind. And one of the things I began to realize is putting myself in at least one major thing of my life where I was a beginner or an amateur, but I wanted to learn. It kind of seeped into the rest of the areas, and it stoked a desire to learn and improve and question assumptions that affected me and helped me in all areas. And so, or as one of my mentors, who's was the publisher of the Miami Herald, he said the trick to life is to be a lifelong learner. And for him, that means reading one book per week, which he's done for about 60 years running. So those are some of the things I've learned. It's been a great ride. I'm looking forward to this work that I'm going to be doing, mobilizing companies and people who love India and are from India to bring India to the point of zero poverty. I look forward to continue to explore collaboration with the University of Maryland, with its students, faculty, staff, alumni. It's been great, and thank you for having me here today. So I think I've left some time for questions. I hope some of you have them, or comments, or suggestions, or you want to dispute something that I've said. That'd be fun. Please, I guess you come up to the mic here. I think there's a mic set up.
I can just
Okay.
So when you have the project with India, do you have a cultural barrier? Just because you're never been their country or...
Yeah, so the question was, well, cultural barriers. I mean, gosh, cultural barriers exist everywhere. I mean, when I go down with my musician friends in North Carolina, talk about some cultural barriers that I've had to learn, and some new regional dialect. But in India, one of the things that we've always believed, I've always believed especially, is that growing up with the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, which was a Bangladeshi organization trying to solve the issues of Bangladesh, with rare exceptions, Grameen Foundation has always worked through local organizations that were owned and managed and governed by local people. So we were their strategic partners. We'd provide them capital, we'd provide them expertise, we'd kind of, sometimes they'd get more attention paid to them if they were known to be working with a respected international organization, which some thought we were. So we had assets, but we never wanted to go in and compete with them. We never operated on a real retail level. We went through local organizations. Now, were there sometimes cultural issues that came in working with them? Absolutely. Misunderstandings, not shared expectations. I mean, I spent 6 years in Bangladesh, which is, it's essentially was a part of India, before the British left India. So I knew that part of the world, but absolutely. And I think the only way to, and even there are cultural issues that exist within India, between the north and the south of India, for example, between the northeast of India and so forth. But my view is that as long as you work hard, your intentions are pure, it isn't about you, it's about the mission, just about any cultural faux pas can be can be resolved, can be moved past, especially if you're willing to learn about it, and especially if you're willing to laugh about it, which is sometimes all there is to do. Now, I would say that Grameen Foundation, as much as we were able to, sometimes in India, it should have taken, Grameen Capital India should have been launched in 6 months. It took 4 years to launch. We never kind of got on the same wavelength with the lawyers and the government officials that needed to sign up. But things would get done. We also had a great experience working in the Middle East and North Africa with our Arab friends and partners. But China, we never got China. China never got us. And we had a decade-long, 2 phases of work with all the excitement. It never really worked. So some things you just can't, and it was probably our fault. I'm not saying it's the fault of the Chinese or our Chinese partners, but in the areas where you can have your faux pas, but you just, in the end of the day, get things done. That's where we tend to just focus our energies. Thank you. Great question. Is there a question back here? Yeah? Oh, great.
I have two questions. One is what one of your greatest regrets is working in this field, and then two, what's one of the most exciting social entrepreneurship activities that you're mentoring right now, or that you see happening?
That's great. Thank you. One of my greatest regrets. So there was a crisis in India microfinance in 2006, and it was localized to one district, not even one state, one district. And we, Grameen Foundation, we were part of the leading. It was not well publicized. I mean, we didn't want it publicized, but quietly and with a lot of effort over 9 months, it was resolved. But basically, local government officials in one state in India, where there was a lot of microfinance, became opposed to it. And there was a lot of misunderstandings by the government, and also some self-interest about how they wanted to defend their own government credit programs. And once we kind of took care of that, many of us, myself included, just hoped it would never recur, even though on my quiet moments I thought that it might. And in 2010, as a result of a series of things, including one microfinance leader profiting enormously himself personally, not by commercial standards, but by the standards of what you'd expect of people working in social change in India, was shocking. And this backlash from 2006 came back in a much worse form in 2010. It basically set the field back 5 years, and it set us back, our work in India, about 5 years. So I regret, maybe if you asked me the question tomorrow, I'd say something else, but what is not doing more in that gap between 2006, where we kind of averted a crisis, stayed it localized, and it kind of, but didn't really take the steps. Given what's at stake, the microfinance sector of India is still the largest in the world. So that's one. The thing that I'm most excited about is also one of the things that's newest to me. And by the way, thanks, two really good questions. One of our most generous donors to Grameen Foundation, well, in my introduction, let me go back. There was an organization called Results, and my friend Nick Arena, who's been involved and worked with Results over the years, Results model of grassroots advocacy for social change was applied by one of my mentors and donors, Marshall Saunders, and applied it, I think because climate change is more in the news with more opponents, but also with more kind of energy, applied the Results model to climate change and created an incredible organization called Citizens Climate Lobby. And a topic of which I don't know that much, climate change, just what I read in the papers. But I've been getting progressively involved, mentoring the CEO, who's this amazing man named Mark Reynolds. And now I've been asked to join the board of Citizens Climate Education to help apply what I've learned through governance and through growing Grameen Foundation to this organization, which literally, like a Results that's been around 35 years, the average conference where people fly in from around the country, it's 300, 400, 500 people tops. And Citizens Climate Lobby started with 25 people, has been doubling every year. And the last conference they had, I think, had more than 1,000 people. And they're now actually limiting the number of people that can go to their annual conference because they just can't handle so many. So I'm very excited about both brushing up and learning more about the science of climate change, but also being able to apply what I've learned growing Grameen Foundation to having this organization that's taking on one of the most critical issues facing the planet. I think we may be out of time, but maybe we're done?
Probably stop.
Okay.
I'm so sorry.
No.
Thank you to Alex Katz.